It's important, when people write and they produce something that's meant for public circulation in order to inform people, including of what's going on in the present moment, in order to be able to give an appropriate context to events at the time. This is important not only for the present, but it's also important for what happens in the future, including how events at one period of time may lay a foundation for later events. Something should happen, and those very important reference materials that have recorded or documented or presented the history at the time it was the present taken out of circulation, there can be very significant consequences later on. Not only because culprits might be able to get away with crime, but also because without an understanding of events that happened in the past, you yourself could attempt to engage in some sort of present activity and not understand that somebody who had a longer term view and access to information that was supposed to be made publicly accessible so that you could protect yourself had found a way to consolidate access to such resources for their own private use, including a private use that is against the public good. It's one of the reasons why I was very grateful when I found this book by Neil Borofsky, who was the former Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program. At the time, I was not much aware of what exactly that program was or what was expected from it. But I'm going to go ahead and start this by reading a few things that are excerpted from this book that he wrote in 2012. Bailout: How Washington Abandoned Main Street While Rescuing Wall Street. Page 82. Enter Wall Street. The banks realized that they could create the same kind of mortgage backed securities as the GSEs, only without having to guarantee the payments by focusing on the types of loans that fell short of the GSE's requirements. These were called subprime loans because banks made them to borrowers with lower credit ratings who lacked certain documentation or who had less money for a down payment. First, banks would pay the investors high interest rates depending on the level of risk an investor was willing to bear. They did so by issuing a number of different bonds called tranches off of a single pool of mortgages, with each offering a different interest rate corresponding to the riskiness of the bond. The higher the risk of default, the higher the interest payment offered to the investor. The second way in which they enticed investors to purchase the bonds was by convincing them that higher ranked tranches of bonds posed almost no risk. First, they built the bonds in accordance with complex mathematical models that indicated that there was a very small chance that large chunks of the loans going into any single pool would default at the same time. The second, perhaps most important step in marketing the bonds as safe investments was convincing the credit rating agencies to bestow high ratings on the bonds. With 5,000 subprime mortgages potentially stuffed into a single bond and no loan level detail offered to investors, it was impossible for investors to research and analyze all of the underlying loans to make sure that their investments were safe. Credit rating agencies helped solve that problem. In theory, the agencies were supposed to do their own analysis of the underlying loans and give an unbiased rating, which was essentially the agency's opinion on the likelihood that a bond would pay off. But the agencies were working under an enormous conflict of interest that highly incentivized them to provide the Wall Street banks with their stamp of approval on the subprime bonds, and that conflict would eventually help fuel the financial crisis. For their part, the banks buying the mortgages weren't terribly concerned about the obvious problems with the mortgages being thrown into these pools. The profits from the securitization mill were too high, and the losses would not be borne by them, but by the investors buying the bonds. Later investigations would demonstrate that several of the largest banks had been on full notice that the mortgages they were packaging were littered with fraud, but continued to sell and package them. This further decline in underwriting standards led to what were, in essence, subprime bonds. But those too were given AAA ratings by the conflicted rating agencies based on their mathematical models and similar lack of concern about the quality of the loans that were being pooled. So voracious had the market for highly rated mortgage backed securities become that even as Wall Street and the mortgage lenders radically expanded the supply of mortgages by destroying lending standards and ignoring fraud, there still weren't enough loans to supply the unquenchable demand. The banks were also looking to move some of the lower rated, non AAA rated tranches of the bonds, which they sometimes found themselves stuck holding, particularly as investor appetites began to wane for the lower rated tranches. Wall Street managed to kill both birds with a single stone. The banks created brand new bonds by purchasing the lower ranked tranches, to which they gave the arcane name collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. Wow. It would really, really be a serious situation if you were in, I don't know, say, the office of the president, and you had a financing situation that required you to be able to access your pension benefits in order to accomplish certain goals. And then it just turned out you did not have enough collateral backing the loan pool with what was readily available, including ranked at the level you expected yourself to be ranked, right? I mean, who thinks about such things? Who would ever have a need to think about such things? Part 1.